at us. They're the EMTs today.
We're not going to need EMTs.
Okay, so if anybody has any questions during the broadcast, be sure to type them in the comments and we will try to answer them. And Tim is going to talk really loud. And he has a microphone. So
It's a gorgeous day.
For all our new watchers, we're down here on Austin's Mill Pond. We're going to be talking about the history of the pond, the state park, and Baird Island with Tim Ruzek.
So we can go ahead and get started. Tim can introduce himself and talk really loud.
All right. Do my best here. Tim Ruzek, I'm the water plan and outreach coordinator for Mauer Soil Water Conservation District and Cedar River Water Shed District. I'm going to try to multitask and keep myself in place while doing this. We also have our summer intern, Maddie Hackensmith, who's a boat captain today with Holly. And we also have our watershed technician, James Fett, who also would be available if people have questions of anything about the watershed. You know, we've got people here to answer that. And then Paul Hunter, district technician, with Randy. So this is a new event, something fun, something different. So I've done presentations here in town, including a walking tour last year, hosted by the Hormel Home and Historical Society. So now we're trying another element to that. So the presentation I usually give is called Flood Walls in a Former Swamp. So you can see the flood wall that was completed within the last decade. And this area that we're on right now and that the flood wall's on and that it's protecting was a big slough or backwater swampland for many decades in Austin's history until it was created into a state park. So the swampland here at that time, there's different maps that will show you different layouts of things. Of course, it depended on the height of the dam, the river levels, but some of them, I think the best map is like an 1876 map. The Historical Society, I think, has a big wall version of that. Lots of islands shown. There was a Paddens Peninsula that came off of where North Main Street ended, kind of where Wells Fargo is today, just a little north of that. And at that time, it was known as dotted with wooded islands. And in fact, when they first started making the state park, they were promoting Horace Austin State Park as having being dotted with wooded islands. And even though in the end they decided to connect the islands to the mainland or dredge them away. So back then, it was considered an eyesore, mosquito-ridden swamp. A lot of complaints about it. There's kind of a main channel that would most of the time have water that you could distinguish as the main channel of the river. In the wintertime, though, they would clear off some area to have ice skating. They had a toboggan slide. And there was a steamboat, a little steamboat called the Belle of Austin that I think around 1894 till a little after 1900 would pick people up at the end where North Main Street used to end. And keep in mind where the city pool is today, there was actually a channel of the river, including part of the Cedars of Austin was a channel of the river. So back then it was a completely different layout. And the Belle of Austin would give people these evening boat trips, unless from about 7 o'clock or 7:15 it would pick up people at the landing and do a 6-mile round trip up to Oakwood Cemetery where there was a Columbia Island back then with a pavilion, and then back again. And they had played music on board, live band of course back then. And there was one complaint in one of the newspapers back then of the little whistle on the Belle of Austin being really annoying. So not everybody was a fan of it, but that operated quite often. Again, evening boat tours. I think on the weekends they do afternoon boat tours as well. So it's something to do. And again, a much different trip on the river than what we've had here for the last century since they created the state park. Where the boat dock is, as long as we're over in this area, I'll skip ahead to the state park portion. Where the dock is used to be the state park's bathing beach, the swimming beach. Lots of iconic photos and postcards from back in that time. It used to be a much deeper pocket for the swimming beach that go back toward where the pool parking lot is today. And then when they opened the city pool in 1939, they filled in that part of the river to add more parking. And that actually, when we talk about Lyman Baird, the ancestors, the heirs of Baird, were actually upset with the city for that in the early 50s and and challenged them on what they were on how they were reusing the state park land. So Horace Austin State Park, that development of that gave us what we've had here for the last century, and we'll touch more on that here in a bit. But this is the Austin Mill Pond, which really has always just been called Mill Pond probably since the state park creation. Before that, it was called Coon Lake, over by where the original Hormel plant used to be. Behind me, there was kind of a body of water that on some maps in the 1870s was referred to as Coon Lake. And then in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was called Lake Lincoln. And so Lake Lincoln seems to be from that stretch to the body of water that was off of where Main Street used to end. Why that went away, I'm not sure. But when they created the state park, it seems like that reference to Lake Lincoln they stopped using that and just kind of ended up referring to this as the Mill Pond. I like to call this Austin Mill Pond because we do have two mill ponds. Upstream from the old mill restaurant, we have Ramsey Mill Pond, which was also created back in the 1870s. So our names here for water bodies, when we end up talking about the island here and why to name it, I think it's kind of the reasons that there's not a lot of solid water names. Austin Mill Pond, just again been called Mill Pond for most of the last century. Eastside Lake's just a directional name for that lake that was man-made in the 1930s. So the islands had some nicknames over the years, like Monkey Island, I guess. Some people have been telling me. No monkeys actually were on there. The monkey cages were over where the Cedars of Austin is today in some cages in the 1930s. But some people growing up were told by people that monkeys were out here, or they referred to this island as Monkey Island. I had a neighbor actually last night tell me that too. So that is news, but it doesn't seem to be official by any of the newspaper accounts. In the 1970s, they tried to beautify this island, or they did a beautification project for the island and the general shoreline area, and they referred to it as Cedar Island, but that, again, did not last. It seemed just to be as part of that beautification project, they kind of temporarily named it. So with the body of water here, the Austin Mill Pond, it was used for a lot of different things before a state park. One of the big uses was ice harvesting. And so behind me was a couple ice fields. Directly behind me where the Hormel plant used to be, they did a major ice harvesting operation there. I think they worked around a rice bed that also existed along that area. And then over by the library was a different one. It was a private business that harvested ice, and they delivered it to homes in the community until people could have their own household freezer. And I believe there's another one where the bottler farm was another ice harvesting operation there too. So the Cedar River was especially this backwater area that was deep enough to really produce good ice, was really relied on by the community and by Hormel Foods until 1936, when the company was able to, for one, the ice harvesting supply wasn't enough for their needs in the mid-1930s, and then the technology had gotten better too, where Hormel could produce their own ice. And so around that time is when the community and the company stopped relying on Austin Mill Pond for ice. They also, lots of recreation here. So when we look at that shoreline where there's a lot of trees right now, that was a much longer swimming beach. They had a slide, big wooden slide that came into the water. Where the fishing pier is, I think maybe just closer to us from there was a big dock that
Fish.
There's a fish jump where it looks like people, kids would just go jump off the end of the dock into the river here. Lots of stories on the pre-air conditioning days of people downtown of all ages, escaping just a couple blocks from the downtown offices that were hot and coming down here to cool off. So much different era than what we're used to here. That's not to say that the water was super clean for them. And there's some articles in the 1930s of the city shutting the beach down for a weekend, lowering the dam a little bit to get more flow through here, and pouring chlorine directly in the water to kill bacteria. So that eventually, those ongoing problems, and then those would pop up too with Eastside Lake once that beach opened up about late 30s, 1940s. But that led to the city pool being the first city pool being built where the current one is in 1939 for greater safety, because there's also quite a few stories over the years of kids being rescued here who are drowning out in the water, obviously tougher to see than in a chlorinated pool, and then for better sanitation too. The first pool though they pulled water in from the river and then they chlorinated that, as opposed to today where it's part of our municipal water system. So back then they also had quite a few events down here, a lot of cool photos of people just lining the shoreline here and a bunch of canoes out like we're on the water right now. So in the pre-technology days, this was a big attraction for people to come down, whether they were going to walk the state park area. There was a drive that you could take your vehicle on down to where the old power plant used to be. There's a playground set up, clay houses, things like that. So a lot of history in this area. And again, that whole state park portion over there where the city pool is today was built up. It was filling in parts of the river and adding more height to that land than it was before, because it was just mainly swampland and river channel. So when they did the first major dredging here in the early 1900s, 1913, the state legislature approved Horace Austin State Park. And when we talk about the island with Lyman Baird, that really started with his big offer to donate land and $5,000 if the city would match that money to turn this backwaters area that he'd long dreamed of turning into a nice park, to put that toward beautifying this area. So eventually that led to the state park designation. It was named after nobody related to why the town is named Austin. Horace Austin was the 6th Minnesota governor, and all the articles say he never stepped foot in Austin. It's just to honor him. So that's why they designated the name that way. And then the dredging needed to happen. So unlike other areas of the state for state parks where their natural beauty was already there, they're ready just to turn it over into a state park, this one needed lots of money and lots of time. And reading the articles was way more money, way more time than they ever thought it would. And that really annoyed our friends and neighbors over in Albert Lea. There's quite a few nasty editorials in the Albert Lea newspaper about the taxpayer money being dumped into beautifying this swamp. And so, but it happened, it continued on. The designation happened in 1913. There was some work that happened, but then they needed to wait till 1919. They got some more money for dredging, and that dredging continued. It appears until about the summer of 1922. And so as they dredged, there's an article about an island out here that was rapidly disappearing. Again, other main islands that were close to the downtown land were connected to the mainland, and the dredged material was thrown up onto that land to create the bathing beach. So the bathing beach had, I guess, high quality sand that was dredged from the river and built up and sloped so that it was a much more usable park area. Once that was completed, and maybe we can work our way around there eventually, but the river used to go underneath where North Main Street is today. And to start with, there was a wooden footbridge that crossed the river at that section, and then later, mid-1930s, they replaced that with a steel bridge that they got from Chatfield, actually. But pretty narrow bridge that later would not prove to be very functional. Let's see, while we're here, other notes, I just wanted to make sure I mentioned the Belle of Austin. I don't remember if I said it, could have 30 to 40 passengers. So in the pictures it looks pretty small, but I guess if they had 30 to 40, they really packed that in. The mill pond also was used for electrical generation, cooling of generators. So in the 1960s, when the old power plant was there, they'd pull water in from the Cedar and cool off the generators with that and kick that water back out just above the downtown dam. And like I mentioned with Hormel, I mean, really, the Cedar River is a huge reason why Hormel, that and George A. Hormel's vision and hard work ethic and talents, but really he relied heavily on the river to get his company up and going from 1891, and really relied on with, when you're running a meat processing plant, and you got these hot days of summer like we've had here, you need lots of ice to keep your meat preserved. So the Cedar River is heavily relied on for that, and it's pretty incredible reading some of the logistical setup they had there with horses helping to pull chunks of ice up these big conveyor belts into the top of the plant, and it was quite the layout over there. And if I remember from George's book too, him and his wife, I think she was his new wife at the time, Lillian, unless they were engaged, but crossing the Cedar River when he was dreaming about turning this old creamery into his own plant. And because they had gone ice skating, I think, on the Cedar River here. So lots of connections with George. I think when he traveled to work of him crossing probably the Water Street Bridge, today's 4th Avenue Northeast Bridge, and getting up to the plant that way. But I'm sure in the early years by horse, right? Whoop. All right, we're back.
Just a little technical
We'll change
issue.
some scenery. How about that? We'll
Yeah.
go up around the islands here. I'll try to go backwards. Maybe we should, I think it actually gets pretty shallow here. Do you think we could turn around and go around that side instead? Because then it'll stay deeper. Or do you want to just cut out further and go this way?
We can go around.
Go around this way?
Either way.
Alright, we'll just see. Hopefully we won't bottom out here.
Forward home.
Alright, hopefully you can still hear me here. So as we go around, we're going around Baird Island. So it's something that, I guess I had thought of from doing research with the Austin Mill Pond area. And last year when we did the We Are Water Minnesota, we were a host for that statewide traveling exhibit. It kind of came to light because they really focus on telling your local water stories, your local water history. And so for local water history, Austin Mill Pond is a huge part of Austin's local water history. What it is today is in huge part to Lyman Baird, and the magnificent offer, as the paper described at the time, that he and his wife made in 1905, which again was that donation of land and $5,000 in cash to be matched by the city. Lyman, also he was a mayor of Austin, a city attorney. He was involved in state and county leadership positions, including the state fair. I think he was the chairman of the committee that was responsible for amusements at the state fair. He also was a big driver for the first street paving in Austin, even though he would be paying quite a bit compared to others because he owns so much real estate in town. Toward that project, he was a big supporter of it, and I think his pillar of the city that he got in 2018, that's on one of the sections of the flood wall behind us, he also is called the father of the concrete sidewalk era starting in Austin. So Lyman had got his law degree, but never practiced as an attorney or a lawyer, but he got into banking and real estate, and actually served as a national examiner, where he traveled out to Washington, D.C. as far as some banks that he had to do the examiner work for in Minnesota and Wisconsin. So really traveled quite a bit. Again, did a lot of support for making sure Austin was progressing as a city. He, I know he said with trying to turn the Austin Mill Pond swampland into something more attractive and useful, that his quote was, "I've had this in mind for many years. Every stranger who has visited our city, whom I have met, has referred to what an opportunity the city had for making a beautiful park." And he emphasized back in 1905, where the new YMCA rec center is today that you saw earlier behind me, where the old downtown power plant used to be. A good part of that used to be Austin's very first park called Central Park or City Park. And that was it's kind of worked on over the years, but beginning in late 1890s. And then Lafayette Park was early 1900s, right behind that as the second big, city park. So Lyman didn't want to take away from either of those parks. He just said, those are great. I think they look beautiful. We've done a lot of great work with them. So this isn't to take away from them. They're in a good place right now. This is to add to the great park system that Austin has right now, and this opportunity that seems to be available to us to take what is an eyesore, but also people see as an opportunity, and work together to make that happen. So, he made that pitch in 1905. That eventually led to the 1913 state legislative designation of this as a state park. Lyman then deeded over his land, and then that effort really took off from there. So the island, as I mentioned earlier, there wasn't really any official name for it over the years. It is a man-made island by various accounts, newspaper accounts. Even though this was dotted with islands, most of those again were connected to the mainland or removed. And as it goes, the dredging process, material was left there for the island. Some of the comparison maps that I've tried to put, lay out a present-day image over all these islands to basically just one man-made island that was created through that process of making a state park. There was that beautification project I talked about. It kind of mowed this island and left a few trees, much different look than it is today. I don't know how much they ever really used it though. If, people ever stopped out on it canoeing. Really recent 10 years or so, we've seen a lot more water recreation here locally. So my time growing up here from 1980 on, I don't recall as much activity around here, but maybe before that the island was something kids would swim out to or paddle around. While we're out here too, I'll point out over where the tree is, right on the shoreline, the first tree on our left, that's about where the river used to go under Main Street. Prior to the bridge expanding Main Street onto what they call Fox Drive, which is the road that crosses the river today and goes along the west side of the plant. There's that wooden footbridge that people can cross. Right out the big bend of the river. Really popular fishing spot. Landing down there too. There's a 1938 Hormel News magazine that has a nice photo of actually one of our co-workers. I think it's her grandpa's family out on the river in that spot, that bend there. And what it was in a Progressive Austin magazine as well. What I've always found interesting in that photo is that all the water you can see in it, I'm pretty sure today is just street, boulevard, sidewalk. So none of that water that's in that photo is there anymore because in the 1960s, Mill Pond had filled in pretty decently. Austin Utilities was, as I mentioned, they used it for electric generators to cool them down, and they discharged the water back into the river. That warm water would come back to where they were drawing it in, and so it wasn't working as well. So they put in some money for dredging, but the biggest part of the dredging money was for developing Austin's first indoor mall, which is just upstream from here. It was Austin Packaging, then it became Bellicio's. Right now I think it's vacant, but in 1963, November 1963, it opened as the mall. And that came about because of the first hotel motel, which is where the Cedars of Austin is today. So when we talk about the state park, this change to this area to what we know today really started in 1958 when they're talking about taking the state park land and starting to develop it. The state changed the designation of Horace Austin State Park from a state park to a scenic wayside in 1937, and then by 1949 the state gave it back to the city. And they had for years, even 2 years after the legislature approved the state park for Austin, there was a movement by some legislators to give it back because I think they knew the amount of work that would be involved with it. If you can think too, with the Hormel plant, how big that original plant was and sprawling out along the shoreline, that was right in half your eyesight, of the state park from when you look out from the swimming beach. So it had a lot of challenges to it, and so the city was constantly, it seems like, battling with the state to properly fund it, even once they got it, formed into a usable state park. But by the 1958, then the city thought, we really need a hotel motel, $1 million project to really get people to come here. I think I would imagine too for Hormel's clients to really have some nice place for them. There was a nice restaurant, it looked like, where I think the wait staff was dressed as Peter Pan for some reason. I don't know, but so by 1958, the discussion started. The community helped name it the Red Cedar Inn, which people ask, why did that name go away for the river? And I'm not sure, but it seems like that was kind of like the last reference for that, the 1960s, and for whatever reason, the Red Cedar River, that name for here, kind of went away. But 1959, the name was given. 1960, the Red Cedar Inn opened, and then the following year, work began on developing that future site for the indoor mall, like zoning changes and acquiring more land, like 40 acres from a family that lived just north of here. Again, by a development company to not only build the mall, but build adjacent commercial and residential properties. So to do that was a floodplain area with wetlands. You can see all these old aerials where there's water on there a lot of times, and So they knew by the time they completed it, there's some headlines talking about a place that they always considered unbuildable. Now they achieved that. They built this indoor mall on a place that they never thought could be used for that. So they dredged the river, pumped most of that material onto that site, and I think it's about the size of 2 football fields. They built it up at least 5 feet high. I think they excavated down 5 feet and then put in 10 feet of fill. So they raised it up by at least 5 feet across, the 2 football fields. Then they built the building there, and then they had a humongous parking lot for over 700 parking stalls. So quite a drastic change to an area that, again, was flood prone, had wetlands, some of it was farmland. And within a little over a year, then by March, it opened November 1963, by March 1965, they had to evacuate it because the Cedar River in the winter melt had surrounded it with floodwaters, which by some accounts seemed like the worst known flood of that time. There's some debate because the flood gauge south of town was blown out by a chunk of ice, so I don't think it gets registered as among our worst known floods. But that project made the river much deeper for recreational purposes. Water quality wise too, you can see in some aerials from the 50s of a lot of algae, like where we are and other spots. And so the community, it seems like, really saw that as a huge improvement. Even though in 1964 there was a big headline that said they poured $1 million into a big swamp. So I don't know if they thought it was a wise investment. Unfortunately, at the same time, once that mall opened, they continued to build other facilities, like where Hormel Corporate South is today. It used to be the old Kmart. They were experiencing flood issues here in town, and they had in the 1950s as well, but it seemed to be getting worse. And so at that same time, the community was working with the federal agencies and others to be more flood alert ready and planning better for floodplain use. So it makes you wonder under where they switched directions, if they ever would have built that site then based on what they knew a few years after it. So, but either way, they built more apartments. They had some other plans that were drawn up for a convention center and other things that never panned out. But as we can see today, all that investment in there in the 1960s into the 1970s was too expensive to remove through flood mitigation. So the more feasible approach and better approach from the community, it was seen, was to protect it with flood walls and flood berms. And so that's what we have here today. The channel that's just over here by the North Footbridge, that was also dug out in the early 1960s. They dug that channel, they built the new bridge, and then they took out the old bridge and they filled in that old bend of the river. And that old bend of the river was about, in the deepest spot, they had to put 25 feet of fill, and that was a multi-year process to fill in that old bend of the river and make that usable, or at least flat land. So sorry for the feedback here. Getting a little windy.
Are there any questions out there?
Nothing so far? Otherwise, I think we pretty much covered a lot of it here. Like this whole shoreline along the Hormel side, there's lots of different sections that eventually were filled in and connected to the mainland. There was kind of a island of sorts over by Hormel, close to the railroad crossing. That's the southeast footbridge today over at Mill Pond. But they connected that, so a lot of that trail over there, there's good sections of it that used to be part of the river. So just again, one of the many different drastic changes in this area over time.
We have a library and the new rec center.
And a lot of those properties used to be, the 4th Avenue or Old Water Street back then. Those were homes that had big backyards down to the river, or a home that then had a big shed on the back, like where they did the ice harvesting. It was a mix of businesses, but a lot of homes along there too. And then of course the city park, city waterworks building water supply first came from. Lots of wells were drilled at that location until they tapped into the Sargent Springs, which is today's Austin Country Club, about 1911, and piped that water in. And that was a big thing to promote the community by a million gallons of spring water for the community every day. And but that site had a lot of history. Awesome. And of course, we have this backwater because the dam was created for the flour mills. That there were a bunch of them on the Cedar River, especially in the late 1800s, until Minneapolis became a huge place for the flour mill industry, and those smaller mills like we had here just weren't as needed anymore. So today the dam doesn't have its original purpose. It's just for recreational value to hold water back. So in our county, 1 of 4 in Minnesota without a natural lake, we have something that's kind of like a lake. About 23 water acres. Ramsey Mill Ponds, considered our biggest, at about 53. Eastside Lake's 40 water acres. So we have one more in the county at Lake Louise, which is another dammed up river. So that's where, and one thing I didn't talk about, the reason those islands were taken away was a community debate basically on whether to have a state park with lots of different islands and footbridges connecting the islands, or to have a uniform shaped body of water like a lake, like we have today. And what we have today is what won out. Most people seem to want that, plus they thought it would be less expensive compared to maintaining islands and building footbridges to them. Just dredge it out and make a nice lake-shaped stretch of the river.
Okay, I got 2 questions. Do birds nest on the island?
I've been out here a bunch this year. You can definitely hear lots of birds there, including a bullfrog the other week, which is a nice sign to hear. Bullfrogs aren't real common here yet, according to the DNR. I've seen pelicans stop over here, but that's just for a short period of time they've been on the island. But yeah, otherwise I don't know a great deal. I don't know if geese really go up on that island. They move mainly along the shoreline.
Okay,
saw some ducks at the island this morning here.
the other question is, what is the deepest part of the pond and how deep?
All right, which reminds me too. Okay, so 1960s, that dredging project. Big point here at the island, we almost lost the island, and the Herald wrote an editorial saying that's okay because it's all a big sign of progress. It's not a big deal to lose the island. We want this dredging to help develop property upstream and also make this lake more usable for recreation. The mayor of Austin and other city council members got lots of comments from the citizens. They got lots of letters saying save the island. They didn't want to lose it. And I don't know if they typically met on a Friday night or if it was an emergency meeting or what, but the city public works director at the time promised them, he didn't talk with the engineers that did surveying of the water around here for depth, and that they believed the dredging would avoid the island and would be saved. And that's because, and still true today, on the southwest and north side of the island, especially the south and west, it does drop off from the shoreline pretty good. Ice fishing with James, I know we've been out here 10, 14 feet. There can be some spots east of the island. But like at the time with the 1960s dredging, east of the island was the most shallow spot. And so that's what they were going to work on. They said they weren't going to go around it, which then could undermine the island and possibly lose it. Kayaking out here 2 weeks ago. I was about a ways out over here and I bottomed out. So we're in areas that you think are main river channel. There's a lot of sedimentation, stuff settling out, making it more shallow. And so I don't know if it changes too much, but there is a main channel through here, but around the island's actually pretty deep. And that's where you see most of the ice fishing anglers in the wintertime too, is near the island or just off to the right of it.
I lost connection.
Oh no.
Sorry, I lost connection.
There's been lots of good bass caught here this summer. I've seen lots of good bass photos. Somebody just shared it a couple days ago. A nice largemouth they caught over that area. So too, right?
Yeah.
James has caught a nice bass out of Austin Mill Pond.
Giving away fishing spots we are.
Uh-oh.
A lot of
tell his
shoreline, a lot of
secrets.
shoreline.
Okay, I think I'm back now, so hopefully I didn't lose you two. We lost connection there for a little bit. We must be too close to the shore over here.
One other fun fact, when they were dredging the first time for the state park, I think it was over in this area, they unearthed, they believe it was a mammoth tooth. And they put that in one of the storefronts downtown for display.
Where is it now?
It's a good question, I'm not sure.
Randy should have a mammoth tooth.
I'll look into that.
The area also, even though we never had much for permanent Native American settlements here, this was a popular hunting area of the river. When we talked earlier about different maps really showing different layouts for the river stretch here, there's an early 1870s map that just shows it as one nice little stream through here. And so that must have been before they really had much of a dam backing up water. But it shows you more of a following that shoreline there, and a lot of that path and that map would be filled in today with buildings or streets, sidewalks, parking lot. So the flood walls, those were finished about, I want to say 8 years ago, and that's after the 2000, 2004, and 2008 floods. I think 2010, I don't know if that one got on Main Street as well, but this whole area just became a big lake. And 1978, same thing happened there. So very flood prone area. It's just one big bowl really. And so hopefully the flood walls are built a little bit beyond the 2004 levels and will protect the buildings and facilities around here from future flooding.
What are we doing next week, team?
Next week, we're going to be at the Historical Society at one of the original fairground buildings. So we're going to do a little history of the Mower County Fair, and the first original one of the fairgrounds buildings. So join us next Wednesday from our virtual fair.
In case you guys didn't hear that, next week we are going to go live from the Moore County Historical Society, and they're going to feature the original fairgrounds building, along with a little bit of history of the fair. So we're kind of celebrating a fair without a fair, virtual fair.
A virtual fair.
Yes.
Just looking through my notes and throwing one more thing that I think is important to know. So one of the big reasons why would they develop these areas, and that's because the Interstate 90 that was coming through started getting built in Austin late 50s, and then 1963, I think the interstate was finally completed and opened up here in Austin. So the community, Austin's one of the few on I-90 where the city limits actually hit I-90 or include I-90, and especially back at that time. And so they felt this area, which was seen as Austin's back door, should become Austin's front door, and that's what led to redirecting the river, opening up. If all these people are going to be coming in off the interstate to downtown Austin, let's build up this area, offer a mall, really make it a shopping destination. And then when there was that legendary archway for Horace Austin State Park on Main Street, they also decided